All right, we are ready to get started. Welcome, everyone. We're very excited to have you here. It's Friday Night AI, and it's also our first in what we hope will become a series of events with the goal of engaging more with you and you engaging more with us. My name is Rada Mihalcea. I'm a professor of computer science at the University of Michigan, and I also direct the AI lab. Before we start, I want to very briefly tell you a few things about the AI lab. It was founded in 1988, so that's a little bit more than 30 years ago. It currently includes 20 faculty who work on different areas in AI. Also, a little bit more than 80 PhD students, postdocs, research scientists. And I think we cover pretty much all the core areas in artificial intelligence, including, for instance, cognitive agents, robotics, computer vision, natural language processing, machine learning, with deep learning, reinforcement learning as different facets. So we cover a lot of the important areas in AI. So for today, we are focusing on ethics and self-driving cars. And I'm very pleased to have two of the faculty in the AI lab who have been thinking very deeply and working on these topics for several years. So we have here Professor Ben Kuipers, who received his PhD from MIT and works on artificial intelligence broadly and robotics, focusing on representation, learning, and also the use of foundational domain knowledge for problems in robotics and AI. One of those foundational domain knowledge consists of ethics, and so we'll hear more about his thoughts and the work he's been doing in this space. We also have Professor Ed Olson. He is both a professor at the University of Michigan in the AI lab and also CEO of May Mobility, which is a startup that's focusing primarily on bringing self-driving cars for people's enjoyment of their time, and he will tell us more about his work there. He was also named one of the Popular Science Brilliant 10 in 2012. So with that, I figured I will say the thing that he's unlikely to say. So the plan is that we will start with a few questions so that you also get a chance to know better the panelists, and then we'll open it up to you to ask your own questions. So if you want to think what questions you would like to ask, you'll have an opportunity to do that. I will also say that because we are recording the event and also there are speakers around, before you ask your questions, if you could please wait for a microphone. So we have Aura Bunescu in the back, who's been helping with the organization of this event, and we thank her for that. And we also have two volunteers, two PhD students from the AI lab who are again helping with this event, Max Smith, and we also have Santiago Castro right here helping out, and they will pass the microphone before you ask the question. Okay? So with all those logistics set up, I would like to start with a question for the audience to get to know you better. What was your career path? What brought you into AI, and what keeps you here?
All right. Well, I was a childhood nerd, the sort of kid who would dress up as a 5 1/4-inch floppy disk for Halloween. Not realize that I was a nerd about it. So ended up building robots. I went to MIT as well. Spent about 13 years there doing my bachelor's through PhD. I was lucky enough to work on a bunch of underwater autonomous vehicles for the Office of Naval Research. And then the 2007 Darpa Urban Challenge came along. And that was a great opportunity. I was one of the student leaders on that team. Wrote a huge amount of code for that system, which was a lot of fun. MIT came in 4th in the contest, which was there were only 5 cars that finished, so we'll call that a win. But this was on the heels of the 2004 Desert Challenge, where the winner was made it 7 miles down course before they were on fire in the ditch. It was a really fast-moving, exciting time to be in autonomous vehicles. I graduated with my PhD in 2008, and then joined the faculty at the University of Michigan. Been here for about 10 years, 11 years now, and built a bunch of autonomous robots, starting off with teams of robots that would do search and reconnaissance and urban reconnaissance. So think 14 dog-sized robots that swarm out and explore a city indoors and outdoors. And there was a big international competition for that, and we ended up winning that competition, which was great. In about 2012, I'm sorry, this is long, but this is, you have a longer history.
Yeah. I got a longer history than you.
I'm like skipping over 4 years at a time. In about 2012, I joined Ford's autonomous vehicle team. Ford sponsored the largest funded research project in the history of the University of Michigan, and I was one of the co-PIs on UM's side. So we built up that team, and then in about 2016, I decided to jump over to Toyota, which was standing up the Toyota Research Institute just down on Green Road. And there I was co-director of autonomous driving. And so the amazing thing about this journey was that we were getting more and more resources, more and more people, dollars, everything we needed to really make this thing work. But the timelines were really long. And so when we were looking at when these autonomous capabilities were going to roll out into cars, we were talking about 10-year-long product development roadmaps. And I looked at the technology and thought, there are things that this technology can do today. Let's go do it. And so that's when I left Toyota in beginning of 2017 and started May Mobility. And May Mobility is our favorite local autonomous vehicle startup. Good crowd. Which is building fleets of autonomous vehicles to really change the way urban transportation is done. So we're not talking about just building more autonomous Lyft and Uber kind of vehicles and throwing them into cities, but really reimagining what city transportation can be like using autonomous technology as a major technological enabler. I'll talk a little bit more about that probably as we go, so I'll stop here. Thank you.
So I started as much of a nerd as Ed, but I ended up...
But the floppy disks were bigger.
Floppy disks were not yet a gleam in their parents' eye way back then. Actually, the floppy disks that I used were about this big. So that was at Xerox Park in the Alto. So I went to graduate school a long time ago, and I was going to be in pure math. And I had really drunk the pure math Kool-Aid. And I was going to be as pure as the driven snow and never do anything practical. And so then I went to MIT, and just on a lark, I took this graduate course in artificial intelligence taught by Minsky and Papert, and the skies opened, and I realized that this is what I had wanted to do for my whole life. And so I've basically done that ever since. And so I was trying to figure out, what should I work on? And I realized common sense knowledge was sort of the core barrier problem back in the day, and but that's much too big a problem. So I started working eventually on common sense knowledge of space, of large scale space, the cognitive map that lets you learn how to find your way around this building or this city from your experience traveling around, and how you can put that sort of thing together. I've started talking about this category of knowledge as foundational knowledge, because it's not just common sense about specific things. It's sort of knowledge of space that lets you learn maps of specific areas or learn how to use a particular mechanism or whatever. So I did a bunch of things, a lot of it involved with knowledge of space, some of it with dynamical change, some of it with objects and actions and so forth. And about 5 years ago, I started realizing I'd looked at the kinds of things that are sort of the physical world, not the social world, the mental world. And I started saying, well, what about theory of mind, the ability to imitate, and ethics? Now, at this point, ethics is sort of foundational knowledge about what's okay to do and what's not okay to do. And we all have a lot of that knowledge. Around this time, people are starting to get more and more scared of what's going to happen as AI takes over. We get these immensely smart robots. Now, we would want them to have some kind of ethics. This is a kind of knowledge people clearly have, but it's hard for us to know exactly what it consists of. And now we want our robots to have it. Now, before we get too panicked about the super smart robots, I might point out that when I got started in AI, this is the early 70s, I was convinced, because of all the fantastic progress I was looking at, we were going to solve this AI problem in 5 years, 10 years max. Well, time zipped on by. It's now been 40 some odd years, and we seem to have an awful long way to go yet. Now, I do think we've made important progress, and I do think this is one of the most exciting things going to work on. So here I am.
Well, thank you. So I would like to take a step back before we even delve into ethics and ask you about your thoughts of what it means for vehicles to be safe. Looking at what human-driven vehicles would do, obviously it's not 100% safe. So what would we expect from these safe driving cars in terms of safety? What it means for them to be safe?
Does anyone in here know how safe human drivers are? How many miles does a human drive on average between a fatality? Anybody know?
2 million.
2 million. Do I hear 10 million? Other guesses? Oh, don't be shy now, right? We're professors, we will wait you out. We'll start calling. Yeah.
Can you tell us more about the human?
The average human. Yes.
15,000.
15,000. So the answer is actually 100 million miles. So humans on average drive 100 million miles for every fatality. And that's including all the drunken, distracted, bad cars, cars that are unsafe. That's really a high level performance. And so as we at Maine Mobility have thought about when can we put our technology into the environment, we ask ourselves a lot of questions. How good does the technology need to be for us to put a family of 4 in the car? And I think the answer actually has 2 parts that I don't see teased apart very often. There's one part, which is the cars need to be safe enough that they're sort of socially acceptable. So, if the autonomous cars were killing people every million miles 100 times faster than human drivers, you'd probably, how many would be on board that?
No.
Right, no, so there's some sort of just threshold of good enough to be socially acceptable. We figure that's probably at least a couple times better than human drivers. So let's say, autonomous cars need to be at least as good on average as a good human driver. But there's another requirement for vehicles too, which is that they need to not catastrophically screw up. Right? If a vehicle has a sign error in it or some dumb bug that should have been detected, exercising due care in the design of the system, that's also not acceptable. Right? It is not acceptable in our mind to build an autonomous vehicle that drives 1 billion miles between fatalities if that one fatality every billion miles is something that could have been prevented by being more careful in the design of the system. So that is an ethical weight on us to always exercise due care, build the system with functional safety, FMEA, being really careful throughout the design of the whole vehicle, and to achieve that level of social acceptability. And so we believe we're there today in relatively simple environments. So we are deployed, I don't know if you know this, Maine Mobility is actually in commercial operation in 3 states. We're live in downtown Detroit. We've carried over 60,000 people. We're live in Columbus, Ohio. We've carried about 10,000 people there. That was the first deployment of autonomous vehicles in the country that was open to anyone, whether you are no NDA, no liability waiver required. You could fly down there right now or drive down there and get on one of our cars, no questions asked. It's still the only vehicle. We're still the only company that operates a service like that. And then we just launched our most ambitious route to date in Providence, Rhode Island. That launched last week. It's a 5-mile route, and we've carried a few hundred people at that point. But that's all along the way. We're thinking very carefully about what is the acceptable level of performance. That's a threshold. But also, how do we hold ourselves to a very high level of quality? Because it's not okay for the vehicle to make avoidable mistakes.
Yeah, I think that's a very good way of looking at it. Another way that is important is that in the United States, somewhere between 35 and 40,000 people die in traffic accidents every year. And that's a tragedy. And it turns out people have studied what the causes of those accidents are, and about 93% are due to some form of human error. Now that's sort of unbelievably high. So these are figures that are often used to show the opportunity to make autonomous vehicles that are a heck of a lot safer than people are. Now on the other hand, we seem to be a fairly long way from achieving that. We still have boneheads who get into a car that says it has an autopilot and then don't pay attention and don't hold on to the wheel, and then it drives under an 18-wheeler. And there are worse things that do happen sometimes. Now, my criterion is, or one of the criteria here is that I would expect a self-driving car in any given context to have a lower probability of getting into a fatal accident than a competent and alert driver. Now, one of the big advantages that we would have with autonomous cars is that even if they're not super smart, they pay attention all the time. So I was figuring that one of the challenges I'd like to see people like this work on is deer collisions. I've hit a deer one time, and I consider myself a really good driver. I was driving along, paying careful attention, and it just appeared. No warning, no nothing, it was just there. So part of my vision for autonomous cars is that you would have the robot continually paying attention. Now, it might only get 300 or 400 milliseconds warning. Now, if I get 300 or 400 milliseconds warning, there's not much useful I can do with it. On the other hand, it may be able to make a decision so that deer hits the quarter panel rather than the windshield. And that's enough. So I think there are nice opportunities here. But I think as Ed was pointing out, there are a lot of sectors of driving. And I think driving in downtown Ann Arbor is going to be one of the later ones. Driving on interstate highways is going to come a lot earlier. Having trucks that drive from freight depots in the outskirts of one major city and take it to another major city, where the cargo is then picked up by a human driver, I think will happen a lot earlier. So I think people will be finding ways to incrementally incorporate this into our society.
I want to argue with you because
Okay.
for fun, because this would be fun.
Yeah.
So the environments that will see AVs first, in other words, where we're able to be safe enough,
Yeah.
I wouldn't put freeways before Ann Arbor.
Okay.
I think that what we really need to do, how many of you have done an FMEA? Great, you guys know what I'm talking about. So it's the probability of failure and the consequence of the failure, the two major factors that you consider. If you're on a freeway, it might be structured. It's a highly structured environment. There aren't pedestrians, there aren't bicycles most of the time. So that makes the probability of a failure very much lower than in Ann Arbor. But what are the consequences? The severity goes way up. And actually the challenge at higher speeds is the sensors perform less well. So you can't see as far ahead. So where we're going to start, if you think about this two-dimensional space of complexity on the x-axis and severity on the y-axis, autonomous vehicles are going to start near the origin and crawl out from the origin, not move along the x-axis.
I'm not going to argue with you on this one. I mean, since
I
you're
was
someone
waiting
who
for
is
that.
deploying autonomous vehicles in downtown areas, I would say you're probably in a pretty good position to have an opinion.
All right, so now that we got a thread started on self-driving cars and what it could mean to be safe, I would also like to get the thread started on ethics and morality grounds. And for a long time, we've been using trolley problems and the like to get some estimates on human judgments of morality. So my question to you is, first, if one of you could please describe the trolley problem, just to make sure that everyone is on the same page. And then second, is the trolley problem and similar problems a useful way to look at autonomous vehicles?
Okay, I'll field this one first. The trolley problem, we have to start with the trolley problem to kind of get it out of the way. The trolley problem is a very useful thought experiment created by philosophers to help them discriminate between certain ideas about how ethical decisions are made. And so it's very useful to professional philosophers. Just don't do this at home. On the other hand, I think that it's not particularly useful as guidance in how to build self-driving cars. So the trolley problem asks you to imagine that you see a runaway trolley car. The driver has passed out or something, and it's on a track, and it's going to hit 5 people who are working on the track and unaware and kill all 5. Except that there's a switch that would switch it onto a side track where there's 1 person. And you happen to be standing next to the switch. So the question is, do you throw the switch, or do you leave it alone? Do you let the 5 people die, which is what the thing is going to do, or do you switch the switch? Now, you have now taken responsibility for that 1 person's death. Now, you give this to a large group of people, which is done to college sophomores, 5 professional philosophers. And about 80% of most large groups will say, yes, you do throw the switch. You save the 5 at the cost of the 1. And so people look at this and they say, oh, well, it's pretty clear how they're making the decision. 5 is greater than 1, and so we have to do that. But that's not the whole move. What the philosopher then says is, okay, let's imagine the same trolley on the same track, but there's no side track. And you are on a bridge over that track, and you're looking at the 5 people who are about to get massacred. And you think, I could jump down in front of the trolley and give my life, and I would stop the trolley and save those 5 people. But no, you're just a little waif, and so you wouldn't. It wouldn't work. They would run you over and then kill the 5 people. But fortunately, you're standing right next to a large man who is also on the bridge, and you could push that man off the bridge into the way of the trolley where he would be killed, and you would save the 5 people. So 5 is still greater than 1. Now, what do you suppose happens when you ask a group of people to answer that? They say, absolutely not. No way in the world am I going to push somebody to their death, even to save 5 people. And so what the philosopher concludes is that the 5 greater than 1 criterion is not the answer. There's other things going on, and it's been quite an industry in the philosophy world comparing different theories about this. So when I was hearing an expert who you know, Chris Urmson, was saying on this thing that, no, cars are going to drive so that this never comes up. And I think that's the right answer. Because what happens is, when they take the trolley problem and they transpose it into the self-driving car scenario, they talk about, Here you're a self-driving car zooming down a road, and it's a very narrow road, and there's no place to pull over, and suddenly a pedestrian appears in your way, or maybe two groups of pedestrians, and you have to decide which one you're going to kill, or there's one group, but you could crash the car and kill your passengers, and so you have to decide who's going to die. Now, that's posing a question such that both answers are wrong. There is no good answer to that question. And actually, pretty much every driver knows that. And what they know is if you turn into a narrow road where you have no options, where you don't see any pedestrians at all, it looks perfectly safe and clear, you slow way down. Of course you slow way down, because you need to preserve your options. Because something unexpected could happen, and you have to have room to respond to that. Now, one of the things the philosophers do know about is that ethics is a skill. Ethics is a skill, like carpentry, that you get better at with practice and by learning to anticipate various situations. Like, if you're in a narrow road, you need to slow way down. But there's plenty of other scenarios where you learn something else very specific about what you do. This is called practical wisdom. And so part of what we need to learn when we learn to behave ethically in the world is to anticipate those upstream decision points where one choice could put you into a situation where you have to pick the lesser of two evils, but the other one avoids the terrible decision entirely. And knowing to make that choice earlier is the practical wisdom. And as we go through life, we accumulate a lot more. And I think it's totally reasonable for us to expect self-driving cars to accumulate a substantial body of this knowledge.
Absolutely. So, a vehicle needs to be able to foresee danger and behave in a reasonable way. I'm not sure that we can expect a car to always avoid difficult challenges. I think that autonomous vehicles will still get into accidents because things will break unexpectedly or, things happen. I think that's what the t-shirt says. Things happen, right? It's not what the t-shirt says.
Never mind.
So they're still awake. So we think a little, I think the problem with the trolley problem that's what maybe a lot of you are thinking about is that it presupposes the outcome, right? These trolley scenarios are ironclad. You know what the contract is, you're deciding between A and B. And one of the things that probably intuitively is bothering you is that would pushing the fat man over onto the train actually do the trick?
What if it didn't?
What if it didn't?
Yeah.
And that's why I wouldn't push the guy. So this notion of uncertainty is actually really critical, and it's something that's usually omitted in large part from the trolley problems. And uncertainty plays a huge part in the way that we design an autonomous vehicle. If a vehicle is looking at the world and it sees, oh my gosh, if I do A in about 50 milliseconds, I'm going to hit an object. I'm going to hit pedestrian A in 50 milliseconds if I go this way. Or I've got this option over here. In 500 milliseconds, if I do option B, I'm going to hit that pedestrian over there. Which option would you pick? Now that I've just added time to it, and the hint is uncertainty, what do you think the car is more confident about? Its prediction of catastrophe in 50 milliseconds, or its prediction of a catastrophe in 500 milliseconds? 50, exactly. Right? So the car is going to choose the later option. A lot can happen in 500 milliseconds. The braking system might perform better than modeled. The other car might move. The pedestrian might do a backflip out of the way. 1,000, unless you're that guy who's graduating, tried to do the backflip on stage. But a million things can happen, and crazy things do happen. And so it's actually rational to select options that delay catastrophe, because that catastrophe may never come to be. And that's actually how our system works. If there is a challenge, a hard decision point, we stave off disaster for as long as we can, because that way it oftentimes occurs that catastrophe never comes to be.
All right. So with that introduction to vehicle safety and ethics, just to establish some common grounds, I think we can open it up to questions and have you ask questions in the back. And please, if you could, please wait for the microphone. Yes.
On your comments of how safe is safe enough, I've heard discussion on how the answer to that can be quite different from one culture to another, right? And the example given, frankly, was China, where the decision may be more in governmental hands versus elsewhere where it's more in whatever university hands. But in general, the concept of how safe is safe enough, are there cultural differences to that answer, would you say?
Absolutely. If you have a family member who has serious mobility challenges, if an American living here, and they had the option of being basically stuck in their retirement community, unable to get around, or the option of riding a vehicle that has a 10 times worse chance of fatality, what do you think they're going to choose to do? They can have their lives back and be connected to the world and grocery stores and run errands, and their chance of being fatally killed might only be 1 in every 10 million miles. So just a change of perspective on how bad is the problem that someone deals with, that has a huge impact on what risk they're willing to tolerate. So our perspective is that we need to hold ourselves to an extremely high standard, regardless of what the passenger may tolerate. But it is absolutely the case that different people are going to make different risk, cost-benefit choices.
Other questions?
Ben, you mentioned the very famous Tesla crash into the semi-truck.
Mhm.
And there have been others where drivers weren't paying attention. Is it ethical to ship a self-driving car that requires a human to pay attention all the time?
Could you please repeat the question?
Okay, yeah. The question is it ethical to ship a self-driving car if it requires the human to pay attention all the time? Because realistically, you can tell people that they have to pay attention all the time, and they won't. I think this is a problem that the self-driving car companies are struggling with, because we can't instantaneously throw a switch and then all of a sudden all the cars are self-driving and they all communicate with each other and we avoid all the collisions. We're going to have some combination of self-driving cars with some limited capabilities. On the other hand, if you say it's not ethical to deploy something until it is 100% safe, then I think it's impossible to make forward progress. And exactly how we're going to make that determination in the case of self-driving cars, I think is still being worked out in a bunch of ways. I look back at what happened when they first were coming out with the polio vaccine. So back in the early 50s, they were just discovering vaccines for polio, which, for those of you who were there at the time, was a terrifying plague on people and could just plain happen to you or your kids. I was a kid at the time. But I understand that one of the things that happened is that they put together an insurance program, a no-fault insurance program. They knew that the very early vaccines were not perfect and that some of those vaccines could actually cause polio. But in general, the statistics were excellent. They protected a whole lot of people. So they put together this no-fault insurance program so that people who did get a bad outcome got a very generous settlement and got medical expenses and so forth, in order to allow the society to move forward, because they knew it was probably going to take decades to get this right. And it wouldn't surprise me if something similar were necessary at some point, so that the self-driving car companies would end up chipping in to avoid various problems. Now, I think the issue of irresponsible drivers, I would not want the presence of irresponsible drivers to prevent us from developing what could be a very valuable technology. But on the other hand, I do think we have to protect ourselves from it. And there may be other ways to do that.
I think it's, I'm going to take a crack at that too. I think it's really important that we don't set a 100% failure-free threshold for cars. And the insurance program, the vaccine insurance compensation, I forget what it's called, was a really interesting way to spread risk over lots of vaccine manufacturers that were out to do good, but might have been quickly unable to continue functioning if something bad happened. In the case of Tesla in particular, the safety analysis for Tesla Autopilot includes the human driver. Right? The human driver is a core part. They know the system can handle situation X but not Y, and the way the system is safe in the end is because the human intervenes in case Y. Now the problem is that we know perfectly well that a human cannot remain vigilant and attentive for long periods of time. Right? You remaining vigilant and attentive while watching paint dry is nearly impossible. And everybody knows this is well-known human factors property. So if you design a system that expects a component of that system, the human, to perform at a level that component cannot perform, you have designed the system badly. And so we would say that Tesla, in this case, designed a bad system, just as bad as if they designed in a braking system that didn't work every 500 times.
Here in front, I think.
Okay, I guess I'll springboard off that idea. Now I'm going to draw a complete blank on what I was going to say. What were we just talking about?
Tesla and the role of the human in the safety system.
And vaccines.
Right, oh, yeah.
And vaccines.
So, yeah, I just started thinking about the crash again, where he goes into the truck. And I don't know why I get so heavy. I guess it's the harm reduction is the ethics standpoint that I would push on. That right now we've got a situation where we're seeing pilots starting to make stick and rudder mistakes because a lot of their job is automated, and they're doing things like on taxiways, like having just problems running into other aircraft or into buildings and that kind of thing. And that's because we're not feeding enough tasks into them. And I think that's what you were driving at, is that at least initially, you want people to keep driving, to keep them like occupied and interested in looking around and stuff, while they get the benefit of the extra sensor load, actually being able to look at different things at one time. But one of the things that I've been wondering about is tells, right? When you have a vehicle that is being driven autonomously, it doesn't indicate a lot of things that human beings do when they're about to turn left. Like people will drift towards the center lane, or they tap their brakes, or there's things that you sort of pick up in their style. And have you, so I guess my question is, what sort of work have you guys done to start picking up on those kind of things to communicate intention and also leak some more information about what the car's going to do?
Yeah,
Could
this
you
is great.
please repeat the question, if you don't mind?
Oh, I repeat the question.
Uh-huh.
What kinds of things are we doing to help a car communicate its intention and to understand the intentions of the other vehicles around it from the sort of small, subtle signals that we all make as human drivers?
Yeah, I mean, eye contact or waving or flipping people off. There's quite a bit of bandwidth for communication.
Yes, and that's a really, it's an open problem. We see different autonomous vehicles with screens in them, with with even sort of torso-shaped things and heads that can move to try to capture that. Taking away the specific like hand gesture type of thing, one of the things that I wrote an essay about is about so-so driving, is the idea that you might have a car that doesn't get into a lot of accidents, but behaves in a very non-human-like way that ends up being a plague on the people around it. A vehicle that sits for too long at a four-way stop. A vehicle that stops unexpectedly or swerves in a way that a human never would. And one of my favorite examples is a vehicle that on the freeway doesn't make room for the car that's merging in that is about to get boxed in and is in deep trouble. The car itself isn't doing anything wrong, but it fails to do something that an alert, considerate human would do in its place. And so I think of these kinds of things as so-so drivers. They're technically following the rules. They're technically not responsible for accidents, but they're sort of littering the world with little bundles of risk and hazard. Whereas a good human driver is more like a vacuum cleaner that is sucking up little packets of risk and hazard by slightly accommodating what the tricky spot that car might be in. And it's really critical as we build systems to think about how we can make our vehicles good drivers and not merely so-so drivers that are technically in the right.
I agree completely. And the notion that situational awareness is not just position and velocity of other vehicles, it's the intentions of the drivers in those vehicles. Now, one of the things that's actually quite interesting is that the things like turn signals were only invented and deployed widely in the 30s and 40s. Before that, people had all kinds of lights and stuff on their cars, and nobody really knew what they meant and what they did, and it got standardized at a certain point in time. When you are considering walking across a pedestrian crossing and there's a car waiting for you, you typically make eye contact, or you see the person waving or whatever, because the person who's driving the car says, I see you, I'm paying attention, I'm going to wait. Now, most of our self-driving cars have no way to express that. They may see you perfectly well. One researcher that I saw has the car back up by about 3 inches, just to say, I see you, I'm not going to come. Now, I think one of the things that will work out over the next decade or so is some suitable set of signals. But right now, we're at the state of the art where every manufacturer has their own. The people in the environment have no way to know what these various different signals mean. But it's sort of part of the process.
Other questions?
There's one way back there.
So you said you already have cars like in Detroit and in some of the cities, so what have you done? Like, how's it working?
So it's
Can you
working.
repeat the question?
Yeah, so the question was, we said that we had vehicles already in operation. So what of that, basically? So what about all that stuff you said about autonomous driving being too hard? So autonomous driving is too hard if you are trying to build a robo-taxi that can do all the things that a Lyft or Uber driver can do. We're nowhere close to being able to do that. I wrote another essay on sort of the Moore's law for autonomous vehicles, where if you look at the disengagement rate of the industry leaders from 2004 through 2000, what year is it, 18, and you fit sort of an exponential improvement curve, you'll find that it'll take 16 years for autonomous vehicles to reach a disengagement rate that's sort of comparable with human level driving. But the key thing is that's for the full problem. Cars that can do everything that a human can do in most of the conditions that a human driver can do it. So how do we operate today? So we don't do that. We operate at 25 miles per hour and less on roads that we have carefully curated. We know every centimeter of these blocks, and we drive the same route 200 times a day. So in terms of understanding what the risks and hazards are on those routes, we know these routes like the back of our hand. You go one street over, we have to do another validation. We can't just transfer it over there. We need to build up the statistical evidence that our vehicles know what they're doing. And so it's about slicing away, reducing the scope of the problem. And the business plan aspect of this for us is that by starting in these environments, we're pulling in data that is incredibly valuable, that allows us to build and make our system better and better. And our ultimate thesis is that we're going to be able to scale our ability to operate in increasingly complicated environments faster than the people who are sort of in R&D lab mode.
And do you find that people are recognizing your cars as well in those areas?
What do you mean by recognizing?
Well, if I'm walking around and I know that that's an autonomous car, I mean, is it somehow marked as an autonomous car, or does it just?
Yeah, you can't miss it. They're goofy white and green vehicles. They're very cute looking. They don't look like science projects. That's actually kind of an interesting aside. Most AVs look like science projects with giant spinning chicken buckets on the roof. We spend a lot of time and effort to make our vehicle look done. And that's an important part of building that relationship with our riders. But yeah, these are conspicuous. They do not blend in with traffic.
Let me ask you a question though. What's the worst thing that's ever happened to one of your cars?
The worst thing that's ever happened. We were at a stop picking up passengers, and we got bumped into by a delivery truck. We're at our stop on the side of the road, and we got hit. It turns out that a typical city bus will get into one serious accident every year. So you rack up enough miles, and these sorts of things will happen. But we've had no injuries, certainly no fatalities. We have a really excellent safety record, in large part because we say 25 miles per hour. 25 miles per hour, there's less kinetic energy. It's easier for us, we can see farther in terms of time preview, because that 125 meters sensor is 10 seconds of advance warning at 25 miles per hour, but only 5 seconds of advance warning at 50 miles an hour. So we can see farther, we can stop faster, because stopping distance goes as the square of velocity. So we can stop in a quarter of the distance of the Uber vehicle, which was going almost twice as fast. And if, God forbid, there was an accident, the kinetic energy of our vehicle at 25 miles per hour makes most pedestrian collisions survivable to the pedestrian. So we are stacking the deck in safety in every conceivable way that we can think of, because that's where the state of the technology is, not just for us, but industry-wide.
Hi. I think can you maybe clarify something you mentioned in your introduction, where am I wrong in saying that you said something about if there's a condition under which if you develop a system that has a fatality every billion miles, you still wouldn't deploy it because of some weird bug or something?
Yes. So I'll state it again to try to be clear about it. It's an ethical question. So suppose you designed a system that performed really well in aggregate. On average, it drives 1 billion miles between fatalities. That's 10 times better than humans on average. But if the time when it actually screws up is an unforgivably stupid design mistake, then that is not forgivable. So the point I was trying to make is that for us to ethically deploy our vehicles, the performance not only has to be good, very good overall, but it has to be free of defects that resulting from a lack of due care.
Okay, that sounds really strange to me because, statistically, you're saving 9 lives every billion miles driven. So, to me, the ethical thing to do is to save those 9 lives, and even if that 10th life is lost due to some really dumb rounding error or something stupid like that, I'm like, well, I guess we should take that as a society because you're still saving 9.
Let me take a crack at this.
But let me jump in so this is our value. Other companies do not value things the same way. So you might start a company and do something differently. That is a standard that we hold ourselves to voluntarily. But even from a very pragmatic perspective, if you were going to be cold and cynical, think about the litigation that has arisen from negligence-derived defects in vehicles. So the ignition switch problem, the unintended acceleration problem. These problems occurred with very, very low probability. So even if you're going to be cynical, you might think, well, so why would we care? Because it destroyed their brands. It cost them enormous amounts of legal attention, but also really caused everyone to ask themselves, do I really want to buy a Toyota? Do I really want to buy a GM? Because I heard that they screwed up, that their engineers were sloppy in their work. And that's not the company kind of car that I want to buy. Now, that was a tiny, very low probability accident. But the idea that we, out of sloppiness or a lack of due care, would cause injury to a rider, even if it's very improbable, is not acceptable to us.
All right, thank you. Just one last comment about this. I guess, like, to me, this is there's a distinction between company PR and actual ethical decision making. So I would say, so to me, the way I frame the problem would be, this is a problem of actual public education of where we need to have more of these ethical discussions, because to me, company PR has nothing to do with ethics. To me.
Let me take a different approach to this question, which is, I think trust plays a very critical role in ethics. Ethics of all kinds. It's trust that people have for each other, and willingness to cooperate, trust that we have in the technology. And so the scenario that Ed was describing was, here you have a self-driving car that behaves extremely well statistically, but every now and then does something that destroys trust. So for example, it will be stopped at, and perhaps, I'm just making this one up, it's stopped letting a pedestrian walk in front of it, and then it suddenly accelerates and runs over the pedestrian. Even if that is statistically very rare, it completely destroys people's trust in the vehicle, the technology, the manufacturer, and everybody else involved. And so I think that it's totally right to put a huge priority on making sure that the vehicle never does something that is going to destroy that trust.
Well, what about the 9 lives that are lost then?
Keep working on it.
I mean, shouldn't you save the 9 lives and work on the trust in the meanwhile?
I think that's part of the question for this panel. It's still
You should work on the trust all the time from the beginning,
Sure.
so that this scenario doesn't happen.
Well, everyone makes mistakes. I'm just saying, if you have an opportunity to save 9 lives, but then it might destroy some trust, I'm like, save 9 lives and, I'll take the hit.
I think we need to be careful to not conflate mistakes that occur even while people are engaging in an earnest engineering effort and being careful and diligent, from the sort of error that would arise from negligence. We are not going to make the claim that our vehicles never make mistakes. I don't think they're going to make a serious mistake like that. But what we're talking about here is making an unforgivable mistake, one that's due to carelessness or sloppiness or negligence. And it's not, we don't have to build a vehicle that way, where negligent mistakes can slip in. We can still deploy our vehicle, and if we've got 1 billion mile per intervention per fatality vehicle technology, then holy buckets, we should make sure that we go and make sure there's not any dumbs in that vehicle, so that we can get it out onto the road. We don't have to choose. We just have to exercise due care as we build that technology.
And I would also add one thought to that. I think there is the point of 9 larger than 1, which is what you are making. But if people lose trust, they will stop adopting self-driving cars, for instance. And so in the long run, you will stop saving those 9 lives because there is no more self-driving cars. So there will be that point there. So we have one more over there. We'll take one more and then we'll have to wrap it up because we are at 7. So one more question. The back.
Sure. So I want to talk about the secondary and tertiary effects of autonomous cars. Last year around June, the World Economic Forum and Boston Consulting Group did a big study on the city of Boston and how autonomy was going to change mobility in the future. One of their key findings that was actually surprising but makes intuitive sense is that once autonomy starts coming into the mix, not even full autonomy, the number of passenger miles is going to increase. And by their estimate, by at least 18% or 16% or something like that. So given that people don't care about their commuting now, they're not stuck in traffic, they can sit and read a book, people don't care as much, and they'll be commuting more, spending more time on the road, using more resources, which could lead to a dramatic increase in emissions. Whether it's electric or gas, that's a comparison, person driving or not, that's a shift in the market. How do you feel about that from an ethical standpoint, especially given all of our current climate crises?
Yeah, it's a great question.
Please repeat. Or I can.
We're worried about perverse consequences that come from making transportation easier, cheaper, like more vehicle miles that add congestion pollution. Is that so? That's a real risk. But the way that we view it is that there absolutely is a huge latent demand for transportation. There are a lot of people who cannot get around where they need to, when they need to, and the fact that we do not deliver that transportation is a major source of inequity in our culture. People who spend 2 hours getting to work. We have a rider in Providence who has to, right now, to get to his work, has to pay $7,000 a year to get where he's going on Uber fees because where he works is on the wrong side of the public transit. Right, that is a major inequity that impacts his life. We have another rider in Detroit who has a 2-hour commute. That's every day. That's 2 hours that he's not earning wages, but it's also 2 hours that he is not spending with his family or providing the love and care. There's huge economic costs associated with our inability to provide the transportation services to tap that latent demand. So I'm going to flip it around first of all and say us serving that latent demand is our goal. Now, what we need to do is we need to do this in a way that is scalable and doesn't cause cities to collapse in on themselves with congestion. Now, the number one problem that we have is congestion. We know how to solve congestion. If everybody rode buses, we wouldn't have congestion problems. But why don't you ride a bus? Because you don't like it, right? The buses are slow. The average speed of a bus in New York City is 7.1 miles per hour. It doesn't get you to where you want to go any faster than just jogging alongside and be like, hey, suckers. Right, so the problem that we need to solve is to create a transportation solution that people like to use so much that they'll actually use it. And that's where autonomous technology is really exciting. We're not talking about littering the roads with more autonomous Ubers. More robo-taxis that carry one person at a time make the problem worse, not better. But we can use autonomous driving to create a new kind of transportation mode, one that gets people very efficiently between points of interest in a city, that increases the average occupancy of individual vehicles. You only need to have an average occupancy of 3 to reduce the traffic in New York City by a factor of 2. You can average 3 people in a vehicle at a time. All the vehicles can average 20 miles per hour. And everybody would get where they're going faster, and you'd have a walkable city. And if you can do that in an economically reasonable way, then everybody can get to work faster, and not just the rich people who can afford an autonomous Tesla. That's what we're trying to build. We're not trying to build an autonomous Tesla for rich people so that they can make their 3-hour commute in LA traffic slightly less unbearable. We're trying to completely reboot how urban transportation works by building transportation systems that integrate with the city, that can create the usage and the ridership that make transportation sustainable and allow us to serve the latent demand at the same time.
All right, so with that, we are concluding here. I would say that there is in the back on the room, there is coffee and cookies. And there are also a couple of pieces of paper, one for a name and email if you want it to be added to our mailing list for future such events. Also one for suggesting ideas for future Friday night AIs. So if you feel inspired, please leave an idea there and we'll try to pursue it as we can. And with that, I would like to thank the panelists and also the volunteers.